Okay, thank you everyone for joining. Today, Chuck asked me to come today to talk about the landscape of scholarly publishing. This is a very, very broad topic, so I just have some high-level highlights, and then I'm happy to dive deep into any specific questions you have. So, as a matter of background, my name is Angela Colmone. I'm the Assistant Executive Director of Science and Publications at RSNA. I have a pretty long publication history, so I started out in the lab. Actually, I trained as an immunologist at the University of Chicago, and then I worked with three societies since then. The American Society for Investigative Pathology, where I was a scientific editor. Then I was with AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, for many years as a journal editor, similar to what Chuck does now. I was with Science Translational Medicine, and then I was the launch editor for the Science Immunology Journal. Then I moved to RSNA as a more business and operations role, really serving as the publisher of the society. And so I oversee the 5 journals that RSNA runs, including launching Radiology Artificial Intelligence. And so welcome. And I have to say, from the society standpoint, I do want to thank all of you for your work on the Training Editorial Board and all of the work that you do for the society. There we go. So what exactly does a publisher do? A publisher generally has 3 main functions. The first is to evaluate and curate scholarly content. So this includes soliciting content that from particular authors, as well as evaluating peer and facilitating peer review for content that is being reviewed. The publisher also disseminates content to the community and the public. As you are very well aware, there are any number of opportunities of sharing content personally as a scientist, but to have a platform to do that and to have them disseminate content to a pre-established audience is an advantage for authors. Also, publishers preserve content for future use. Rather than just sharing something in a transitory fashion, it's a responsibility of a publisher to preserve that content, make sure it's still available. So articles published in Radiology 100 years ago, we still have, and they're accessible on our website. So there's a large archiving function. And just more broadly, I've stolen this slide with permission from the Council of Medical Specialty Societies. So scholarly publishers provide value for a variety of different stakeholders. So we provide readers with high quality, trustworthy information. As everyone is aware, anything you find on the internet, it could be fake. You don't know whether it's high quality and who has done the vetting. And so if you have a trusted scholarly publisher that you know that this work has been vetted, that this isn't someone who has just written a random paper and posted it without actually doing the work behind it. We provide service for authors, investigators, providing that trusted brand, as well as reviewing their research and providing feedback on the research and on the paper to help them communicate more clearly. We provide service for funders, because the research that they fund should be disseminated. Work in science shouldn't happen in a vacuum. If it does happen in a vacuum and nobody knows it happens, it's sort of like if a tree falls in a forest and it doesn't make a sound, or doesn't make a sound. So very much funders want the work that they fund to be broadly disseminated and read and built upon by as many people as possible and really move forward the scholarly enterprise. And as well as for librarians, so we provide shared platforms with standards so that libraries can share content with members of their institutions. They can have peer-reviewed, reliable sources of information, but they can also do this in such a way that it's easier for them to share it and more broadly disseminate. So if you can see my screen, I'll move myself out of the way. Just want to talk a bit about what publishers do as far as the life cycle of a manuscript. And basically what publishers do is they ask questions. So at manuscript check-in, an author will submit a paper, and all of the questions focus around, does the manuscript follow journal guidelines? Is this manuscript up to par as far as including all of the parts of the manuscript, including proper documentation for ethics issues, author contribution, many of the editorial policies. The manuscript then undergoes pre-review by the journal editor and deputy editors. And that part of the life cycle of the manuscript is really, is this content a good fit for the scope of the journal? It could be a really excellent paper, but if it doesn't follow the purview of radiology artificial intelligence, then it probably will be rejected at that point. The manuscript then undergoes peer review, and peer reviewers, the main focus of the peer review process is to evaluate the studies and ask, are these studies well designed and are the results meaningful? These are really two separate questions. Do you get a reasonable outcome from the study? And is that outcome clinically relevant, scientifically relevant? Are we really advancing the broader base of knowledge and or replicating current studies? And can this work be built upon? Another stage of the lifestyle cycle of a manuscript is statistical review. So our study is properly sized. Obviously, you don't want to do a study of an N of 1, and do the data match the stated results? So people will do statistical tests, sometimes the incorrect statistical test in particular situations, and statistical review is very important to make sure that the results being reported actually are the results that the data say should be reported. The next step is scientific editing. And what a scientific editor does is really reads the manuscript and asks, do the conclusions reflect the data and the results? And I can say, having previously been a scientific editor, the answer most of the time is no. Authors greatly oversell the outcome and impact of their results, hoping that their story, the research that they've been doing, will get more uptake, maybe it will be picked up by the press, but it's critically important. And one of the main roles of a scientific publisher is to make sure that results are not overstated. That rather than saying this X result is going to cure cancer, you have a more finite message so that information is accurately disseminated and accurately shared in the manuscript. After acceptance, publishers do copy editing and layout. And really the point of the copy editing and layout is to take the story of the manuscript, take the science that's being presented by the author, and make sure it's written in a clear and concise way so that a variety of readers can get what they need to take out of the manuscript. And finally, publication. The question is the article reaching the intended audiences? If not, what can we do to get this article to different audiences? You can imagine that some articles are very subspecialty focused and need to go to, for example, computer scientists, whereas others may have a broad impact and should be shared more broadly. And so how we can align the intended audience with the article itself. So the second role of the publisher is really disseminating knowledge. We communicate science to a variety of stakeholders with a variety of levels of interest in a particular article. So there are the researchers in the field that the article is published in, the researchers in the broader specialty, non-specialty scientists, clinicians, and then the general public. And each of these levels of audience have a very different level of approach. And so we as publishers try to tailor different parts of the article to these different different levels of audiences. So researchers in the field are primarily interested in the figures and the materials and methods. So when editing, when reviewing, facilitating peer review for articles, look at the figures and make sure that the figures and the materials and methods have an incredible amount of detail and are exact enough so that research can be replicated by other groups and built upon by other groups and be deemed reliable. For researchers in the specialty, perhaps they don't need that level of detail of, what exactly a setting was in a particular situation, but they are interested in the introduction, why was this study done, the results, what was found, and the discussion, what are really the implications of this study. And they can then use that to take the results and move them to another area of research. For specialist scientists, many times they'll just scan the table of contents or the abstract, look at the titles, say, oh, that's kind of interesting. Maybe click in, read the abstract, find the takeaway, but sometimes they won't go through and actually read the details of the research paper itself. And so the abstract needs to be accessible to someone, for example, who is not a radiologist, is not an AI research. So you have a cardiologist reading your paper or a dermatologist. This is a person who is interested and is hoping to extract information, but maybe may not have the jargon and the technical details. And so the abstract needs to be generally approachable. Clinicians, again, even more broadly, we provide visual abstracts, editorials that provide clinical impact information, summaries, and key points. Why is this important to your practice? What can you do to change your practice based on this information? And finally, the general public. We want to make sure that when the general public reads and accesses this content, that they don't get the wrong impression, that we don't oversell, that every other day there is an article that say, hey, red wine is good for you, red wine is not good for you. So we want to focus our content through social media, podcasts, press coverage, and make sure we really distill down the key takeaway points so the general public can understand the value of the work. Piggybacking on this are the way that people can access articles. So there are different ways you can access articles. And I'm talking here generally about business models, and I thought this would be useful for this group to hear. One is reader pays. So this is kind of a distributed business model. So there are a large number of readers reading each individual article, and that distributes the cost more broadly. There are institutional and individual journal subscriptions and also RSNA membership. There is a very broad movement right now, which I can talk about later if people have questions about this, where either the author, institution, or funder pays for open access for the article. There's green open access, where articles are deposited in public archives, such as PubMed Central or institutional repositories. And then there's gold open access. And in this model, the author pays an article processing charge and receives a copyright license and can freely distribute the article anywhere. RSNA journals are hybrid journals. So we do offer green open access, but also have subscription models and the ability for gold open access depending on funder mandates. We also are actively working with institutions for what's called a transformational agreement, so that all authors of a particular institution have open access for their articles in our journals. There's been a recent movement, the Office of Science and Technology Policy through the White House, the OSTP. The previous Deputy Director, Chandra Nelson, has written a memo suggesting that the embargo for scientific publication be moved to 0 days. So for those who don't know, there's a bunch of political finagling about public access to publicly funded research. And the summary takeaway of the Nelson memo is that research that's funded by the US government, by government agencies, should be publicly available freely as soon as it's published. So the Nelson memo said this, and then different government institutions are now looking at ways to implement this. NIH has a new policy out for comment that is suggesting that immediately upon acceptance, the author-accepted version of the article should be available in a public archive. Finally, another way to access articles are preprints. So Archive and medRxiv are some examples of preprint servers, and a preprint is just a article that before it has been undergone peer review, it's posted online. There are benefits and detriments to preprint. Certainly during COVID, many preprint articles that hadn't been properly vetted were picked up by the media, and some misinformation was shared. I'd say that was probably more serious in the case of COVID than it has been in other situations. But I can say that in my experience as a journal editor, if I handled 100 articles a week, about 30 of them had substantially different scientific and research conclusions by the time they were published than they did when they were accepted, or submitted. So you always have to take things posted on preprint servers with a grain of salt, because the peer review process really does substantially change and improve article reporting. So I only have a few more slides, don't worry. So I recently attended the Council of Science Editors annual meeting. And so I just wanted to share 2 themes that were really talked about at the meeting as broad things that need to be worked on and are currently a focus in scholarly publishing. So the title of the meeting was Opening Borders in Scholarly Publishing. And one main theme across all sections was just improving accessibility across all aspects of publication. So this is DEIA. For authors, really improving the author experience and decreasing time to publication, but also lowering barriers to submission. Our articles or manuscripts at this point being rejected because the author was not a native English speaker. And are there ways that we can get past that barrier and look at unconscious bias in reviewers and editors? For reviewers, how can we really acknowledge and credit peer review? And reviewers do a lot of work for journals and for science as part of public service, but deans frequently in promotion committees don't acknowledge peer review as part of the promotion process. So how can we really provide this credit and help promotion committees, tenure committees look at peer review as a service and something that should be acknowledged? For editorial board members, the quote was bandied very frequently seen: if you can't see it, you can't be it. We need our editorial boards to reflect the diversity of the populations in the field and the broader populations of our readers, because each editorial board member has a different perspective, and all of those perspectives will be valuable in really evaluating and making sure we're presenting the broadest share of the science. Finally, of course, accessibility for readers. And I can talk about staff here a bit. So there are any number of ways that we can make articles more accessible for readers, such as increasing graphics, changing colors. We had a staff person at RSNA who did a lot of research and actually just published a blog post in the Radiology Behind the Scenes blog about color palettes and using a scientific color palette versus I think they call it a rainbow color palette. So that figures are able to be broadly seen by people with different vision challenges. So I know that there's a lot of work to be done here, and we're taking intentional approaches to try to improve this across the whole scholarly publishing industry, but additional suggestions are always appreciated. Finally, the last major theme at the meeting, of course, was about generative AI. Everybody's still talking about it. But just some highlights. There was conversation about AI as an author tool. I think the theme of the meeting was, although people are concerned about plagiarism and having AI as an author, really the horses left the stable there. AI is going to be used, and so we should make sure that we have clear policies in place such that AI is used intentionally. Can you use AI for idea generation? If you, for example, are a non-native English speaker and are using AI to spruce up your language, how can you make sure things are sourced properly? So just to have clear policies in place so that people can use AI as a tool and not necessarily as a crutch. AI is a reviewer, apparently, and I had not been tracking that this is happening, and hopefully isn't happening yet at RSNA journals. Reviewers are taking the entire manuscript, pasting it in your large language model of your choice, and asking it to provide a scientific review. That is great, and I'm not trying to give you any ideas here, but there are a lot of concerns about confidentiality. As soon as you take that confidential manuscript and post it in wherever you're posting it, that is no longer confidential, and you've broken the author's confidentiality. Probably the most promising thing really is AI for workflow efficiency. Can AI help with manuscript check-in, automate many of the things we're doing, identify reviewers? Radiographics panel review is already using an algorithm to match reviewers with individual education exhibits. Can AI help with copy editing and layout and other things? I'd say the theme from the meeting is that people are enthusiastic and eager to embrace the new technologies and see what type of advantages we can have. So that is the end of my slides. Thank you so much, and I am happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. I was going to ask about the role of large language models, and thank you for including that insight. One question I had is, and maybe this was talked about at the meeting, but is there any consensus on a standard document or a release form, either acknowledging the use of large language models in authoring, or maybe inclusion of a standard language saying, like I've seen, for example, with the Lancet or others, I don't know if this is required by them, maybe from the authors, along the lines of ChatGPT, for example, was used in the editing and XYZ in the preparation of this manuscript, just kind of keeping that open for the readers. Is there any thought for which direction we're headed in?
So right now, I think we're in the early stages as an industry. You're right. So Lancet, Nature, Science, a number of journals have developed policies. RSNA is in the process of developing policies through our policy work group, but there has not been, and I think there probably won't be for a while, a consensus document for all journals. This is something that's on the radar of a variety of groups that develop standardized processes, such as COPE, the Council of Publication Ethics, and ICMJE, which I can never remember what that acronym stands for, but I encourage you to check it out. International Congress of Medical Journal Editors, maybe. But they're working on it, but getting consensus in this area is slow at best. So not yet.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Thank you for the talk. It's good to know from an insider's point of view what's happening with the publication workflow. The question I had is whether you support or you like the idea of pre-publication inquiries, like sending a small a text of what you're going to publish to the editor before the actual submission to see if the editor likes it, if it fits with the journal, or if it's not a good idea to predispose the opinion, and basically it's better to send the full document with the full figures. I know that some of the journals like Nature or Science following such a policy, or some people are doing it, but I don't think that RSNA journals have such a program. What do you think?
Yeah, so I'll say pre-submission inquiries are very editor specific as to whether they like them or whether they don't. And even within the same family or the same suite of journals, you will have editors who strongly encourage them because they could discourage someone from, formatting and sending their manuscripts if it's inappropriate, or encourage them to add additional data if they don't have it before submission. If I'm going to look at the pre-submission inquiry, it's just as fast for me to look at the full manuscript, so I don't accept them at all. That's kind of the range. RSNA journals do not have an official policy on pre-submission inquiry, but yes, I think that there's also diversity among our editors of who's interested in them and who isn't. I will say that there's a difference for solicited or review content than for original research. So most RSNA journals, depending on the editor, will either respond to a pre-submission inquiry, or if you don't hear in a reasonable time frame, I would encourage you just to go ahead and submit at that point. Don't wait on a response. But for review content, sending in an outline of review that you would like to be solicited, or a perspective piece, that's always a good idea.
Thank you very much.
I have another question. So
Sure.
with you talked about broadening the scope in terms of recognizing peer review, and I really like that idea, and I think there's so much to explore there. One thing I've come across is Publons, and having this format for documenting how many peer reviews you've done. Is that a popular tool among this community, or is this something more of one example of an initiative that may take off, just needs more acceptance? What were your thoughts on that?
So the short answer is yes, Publons is an excellent tool. And I think a few years ago, it was in the exciting but waiting for it to come to maturity stage. What's recently happened with Publons is now it's being able to be integrated into manuscript review systems. And so manuscript handling systems, which makes it a lot easier for reviewers. The previous iteration involved reviewers going and posting, acknowledging that they had reviews in Publons themselves. So having this happen in an automated fashion will allow it to be more comprehensive. And then my personal belief is that if we have a comprehensive tracking of the way that people are doing reviews, then they'll be able to share that with institutions and get more credit. So I think that Publons is right there at the cusp of maturity. That's my expectation.
Thank you. I have another question too, if it's okay. Sorry, I don't mean to. Please, anybody else, if you have questions, stop me in here. But if there's no other question, I wanted to see if we could take you up on the offer regarding the discussion about open access. I personally, I'm just not too familiar with. I'm familiar with open access, but the reason why, it's some of the financial reasons, more broadly speaking, I'm just unfamiliar, and wanted to see if you would be able to build on that a little more.
Sure. So as many of you are probably aware, RSNA is actually launching an open access journal here, or planning to launch an open access journal. We're currently in the editor search process. And so it's really an additional business model. There are a number of funder and reader groups who strongly advocate for open access. If you have an open access paper, then any individual in any country, regardless of their current financial situation, can access the science. And the thought there is it really will move science forward, which is excellent. It is definitely strongly encouraged. The concerns with open access publishing kind of fall on the other end. From a business model standpoint, especially a publisher like RSNA, which puts a lot of effort into customizing articles and really disseminating information through a variety of forms, publishing is expensive on a per article basis. And so open access fees cover less of that on a per article basis than a subscription model would, just because the costs are focused on an individual author rather than being distributed with readers. So the challenge there is a natural pressure to publish as many articles as possible. And then there's a tension between publishing articles with, the RSNA stamp of approval, high quality articles, and, publishing enough to, cover the business model and have sustainable publishing and continue to publish moving forward. So I think that that's something that we're going to actively be looking at for the open access journal. For our current hybrid journals, yes, strongly encourage open access, and anybody who would like to have their articles open access, we support that.
Thank you.
Hello, I have another question regarding open access, and thank you for this talk. I was just wondering how much discussions is going on in the background between publishers and funding agencies. And just a personal example, so I had a grant for my postdoc position, which where I had to publish everything open access, and the maximum embargo period was, for example, there 6 months. And I had team members who were funded by some NIH grants where the embargo period was different, and we figured out that there were actually some journals where we were not able to publish because it wouldn't be compliant with like both of these funding agencies. So I was wondering if there are any discussions going on in the background, because I think for some, especially junior researchers with like, for example, like career grants and things like that, there are like certain journals where it's just almost impossible to publish because they're not compliant just because of these requirements.
So yes, the short answer is yes, there are absolutely discussions, sometimes tense discussions going on between publishers and funding agencies about making sure that there's a shared expectation about what publishers should be doing. Most of those discussions are happening at the large commercial publisher level. I think that the large elephant tends to have more sway. But that being said, I encourage for specific situations. Most journals are able to work with people that have funding mandates, especially diverse funding mandates. I know that RSNA journals, we support green open access for publishers that have, zero embargo funding mandates. And in fact, we automatically send all of our articles to PubMed Central at acceptance with zero embargo. So we're already compliant with that, but it's not something that people track or are aware of. So if you have concerns about submitting somewhere, reaching out to their editorial office is probably the best way to approach that.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
I'll ask one real quick.
Oh.
So back to the topic of large language models, I'm very interested, and I've heard, we've heard of tools that can be applied to a document, and it'll basically tell you if ChatGPT, for example, was used in the production of a text. Will this become another screening layer, do you think, in the peer review process or the submission process, where before the manuscript goes through I guess during the pre-review step, this tool would be applied as a screening and almost like a plagiarism check, but more, if that makes sense. Yeah.
It does. And this was actually a very engaged conversation that we had at the recent CSE meeting. So people have done experiments where they have run documents written through large language models through Authenticate, which is our current plagiarism check, and they come up as not plagiarized because of the way the large language model works, it actually is newly written text. It's not just cut and paste from a particular site. And then the question was, so do we try to integrate this additional layer to see whether ChatGPT or another large language model has written text? And the general consensus was it would just become an arms race. These large language models are going to continue to progress, and that the way that we should address this problem is through education and policy rather than trying to catch someone cheating, just because it will become it will be very difficult, and then we'll be constantly updating the ways that we're doing the checking.
That makes sense. I like the governance approach for sure. Thank you.
Great. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any more questions, and thank you everybody for coming, and hope you have a great afternoon / evening. And thank you for having me guest host this.